December 18, 1944. Northern France is locked under winter cloud. Snow presses against forests and roads. Engines struggle in the cold. Inside a headquarters far from the front, maps are spread across long tables. Red and blue pins crowd the Ardennes. The German offensive has broken through where no one expected it. American units are cut off. Entire divisions are falling back. One town, small, wooded, easily missed on a peacetime map, now holds the center of the storm. Bastogne. The roads that converge there control the movement of armies. Whoever holds them controls the fight, and Bastogne is surrounded. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower faces the most dangerous moment of the European war. His front is bending. His reserves are thin. The weather has grounded aircraft. Every decision now carries consequences measured in thousands of lives. Then a report arrives. Not a promise. Not a plan. A movement already underway. George S. Patton has turned his army. Before anyone expected it. Eisenhower looks again at the map. The pins are shifting, and in that quiet moment, amid snow, pressure, and uncertainty, trust begins to take a permanent shape. By mid-December 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared to be entering its final phase. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed deep into Belgium. German forces were retreating toward their own borders. On paper, the outcome seemed inevitable. But the reality was more fragile. The Allied advance had stretched supply lines to their limits. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition deliveries were uneven. Units at the front often waited days for resupply. The weather, worsening with each passing week, grounded aircraft and turned roads into mud and ice. Commanders spoke openly of pausing operations once the German frontier was reached. Adolf Hitler saw this moment not as an end, but as an opening. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, a sector the Allies considered unsuitable for large-scale armor. American divisions holding the line were under strength, many newly arrived, some resting. The Germans struck before dawn, under thick cloud cover that neutralized Allied air power. The objective was audacious. Smash through American lines, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. In the first 48 hours, the German attack achieved surprise. U.S. units were overrun or bypassed. Communication lines fractured. Conflicting reports reached headquarters. Maps became unreliable almost overnight. At the center of this chaos stood Bastogne. 7 major roads converged there, feeding every axis of movement in the region. German planners understood its value immediately. If Bastogne fell, armored columns could fan outward unchecked. If it held, the German advance would choke on its own momentum. Elements of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division and supporting units were rushed in by truck. They arrived just ahead of the German encirclement. By December 20, Bastogne was surrounded. Snow fell steadily. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Medical supplies ran low. Ammunition was rationed. Artillery fired by sound alone, visibility reduced to guesswork. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower faced a narrowing window. Bastogne could not be reinforced easily. Air support was grounded. There was no spare army waiting behind the lines. Unless one could be created. That possibility rested far to the south, with a commander already known for speed, aggression, and discipline, and not always trusted. Dwight D. Eisenhower did not command through fear or spectacle. His strength was balance. He listened. He absorbed competing views. He measured personalities as carefully as troop strengths. As Supreme Allied Commander, his responsibility was not simply to win battles, but to hold together a coalition of nations, egos, and doctrines under extreme pressure. George S. Patton fit uneasily into that structure. By late 1944, Patton was already a legend and a problem. His Third Army had moved faster across France than any American force in history. His instincts were aggressive. His standards for discipline were uncompromising. But his public statements, theatrical behavior, and past controversies had repeatedly forced Eisenhower to intervene. Eisenhower did not doubt Patton's ability to fight. He questioned his reliability under political strain. The slapping incidents in Sicily still cast a long shadow. Patton's tendency to speak bluntly, sometimes recklessly, had embarrassed Allied leadership before. Eisenhower had protected him, sidelined him, then restored him, always weighing the cost of losing a battlefield commander of rare effectiveness against the cost of public scandal. Trust in this relationship was conditional. Strategically, Patton's Third Army was positioned in Lorraine, driving toward the Saar. His forces were engaged, supplied along a long axis and committed to their own objectives. Turning them north in winter, on short notice, would disrupt logistics, confuse subordinates, and risk stalling multiple fronts at once. Most commanders would ask for time. Patton had already planned for this moment. On December 15, one day before the German offensive began, Patton had warned his staff that the enemy might strike through the Ardennes. He ordered contingency plans prepared. One of those plans involved pivoting the entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north. When Eisenhower convened senior commanders on December 19, the situation was deteriorating by the hour. Bastogne was encircled. German armor was pushing west. The front had developed a bulge no one had anticipated. Eisenhower asked a simple question. How soon can you attack? Patton's answer was precise. Not hopeful. Not conditional. He said his army could attack in 48 hours. In that moment, Eisenhower faced a decision that would define both the battle and the trust between two very different leaders. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was worse. And so the order was given. What followed would determine whether Patton's reputation was deserved or dangerous. Inside Bastogne, the war had narrowed to the basics: cold, hunger, fatigue. The men of the 101st Airborne and attached units dug into frozen ground with bayonets and bare hands. Foxholes were shallow, snow-filled boots. Wounded soldiers lay wrapped in blankets meant for the dead. Medical personnel worked without morphine. Ammunition was counted before every engagement. There was no sense of drama, only endurance. Orders were brief: hold the perimeter, conserve supplies, fire only when necessary. At night, German voices carried through the woods. Engines could be heard starting and stopping. Flares rose and fell, illuminating fields in harsh white light. The soldiers did not know if relief was coming. They only knew they were expected to stay. Patton's style stood in contrast. Where others waited for clarity, he imposed motion. Orders were written, issued, and revised in hours. Corps commanders were summoned, not consulted. Routes were assigned. Timetables fixed. The pivot north began before snowplows cleared the roads. Patton did not promise ease. He promised action. For Eisenhower, this was the test. Trust in war is not belief. It is acceptance of risk. He allowed Patton to strip forces from an active front and gamble them on speed and coordination. If the move failed, the consequences would be strategic, not personal. German commanders believed time was on their side. They expected Allied paralysis. They had seen it before, during confusion, during weather, during surprise. They believed Bastogne would fall, not through assault alone, but through isolation. What they did not anticipate was an American army already turning. While German units tightened the ring around Bastogne, Patton's columns were forming, engines warming, maps marked. The enemy expected hesitation. Instead, they would face momentum. And that momentum was about to collide with winter, terrain, and enemy resistance in ways no plan could fully predict. Turning an army in winter is not a maneuver. It is a gamble. Patton's Third Army stretched across miles of frozen countryside. Roads were narrow. Traffic control points were few. Artillery units had to be repositioned. Armor required fuel that barely existed in surplus. Infantry had to march in conditions that slowed movement to a crawl. The plan relied on timing more than firepower. 3 corps would advance along separate axes, converging toward Bastogne. Coordination had to be exact. A delay in one sector could expose flanks elsewhere. There was no room for improvisation once the movement began. Patton understood this. His orders emphasized synchronization. Units were instructed not to stop for minor engagements. Speed was the weapon. Logistics, often invisible in narratives of war, defined the operation. Fuel convoys moved continuously. Military police directed traffic day and night. Trucks broke down and were pushed aside. Replacement vehicles took their place without pause. Weather compounded every problem. Snow and ice slowed convoys. Bridges were icy and vulnerable. Supply officers worked from memory as maps became outdated within hours. Yet the system held barely. This was not improvisation. It was preparation revealed under pressure. Perhaps the most decisive factor was belief. Patton's staff believed the movement could succeed because it had been discussed before it was needed. Subordinate commanders trusted the orders because they were clear and uncompromising. Inside Bastogne, belief took another form. When word spread, uncertain, fragmented, that relief might be coming, it altered the tone of the defense. Not optimism, resolve. For Eisenhower, watching reports arrive in real time, the distinction became clear. This was not bravado, it was execution. And execution, under these conditions, was the foundation of trust. The outcome now depended on contact, on the moment Patton's forward elements met the enemy and the siege began to crack. By December 22, the movement was no longer theoretical. Patton's lead elements were in contact. Snow continued to fall across the Ardennes, thick enough to mute sound, heavy enough to slow every vehicle. Visibility was poor. Units advanced through wooded terrain broken by villages, each one potentially held by German infantry or armor. Roads twisted through hills and forests, forcing columns into narrow funnels where progress depended on discipline as much as courage. German resistance stiffened as Patton's intent became clear. The enemy had expected delay. Instead, they faced pressure along multiple axes. Small unit engagements flared across the southern approaches to Bastogne. American infantry cleared villages house by house. Artillery was brought forward on icy roads and fired at near point-blank range. Tanks advanced cautiously, engines straining, crews alert for ambush. Time mattered more than ground. On December 23, the weather broke. Clouds lifted. Allied aircraft filled the sky for the first time in days. Supplies were dropped into Bastogne. German positions were strafed and bombed. The psychological effect was immediate. What had felt like isolation now felt like connection. Patton pressed harder. Orders emphasized one objective: break through. Not tomorrow, not after consolidation, now. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division reached the village of Eisenhower just south of Bastogne. Resistance was fierce. German anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions. Infantry fought at close range. Casualties mounted. Then, in the late afternoon, an American tank broke through the final roadblock and pushed into the perimeter. The siege was not over, but it was broken. Inside Bastogne, soldiers emerged from foxholes, some too exhausted to cheer. They had held. Relief had arrived. At Supreme Headquarters, reports confirmed the contact. Lines on the map were redrawn. The bulge, once expanding, had begun to contract. For Eisenhower, this was more than a tactical success. It was proof, delivered under the worst possible conditions, that Patton's promise had been real. and trust once tested had held. Confirmation in war arrives quietly. There was no single announcement, no dramatic pause at Supreme Headquarters when Patton's forward elements reached Bastogne. Instead, there was a steady flow of reports, fragmented at first, then increasingly precise. Unit identifications, grid references, timelines aligning. The contact was real. Eisenhower studied the situation map as the implications became unavoidable. The German timetable had been broken. Bastogne was no longer an isolated objective. It was now an anchor point around which Allied forces could reform. The enemy's momentum, once feared unstoppable, had stalled under pressure from the south. What mattered most was not speed alone, it was accuracy. Patton had not merely arrived early. He had arrived when and where he said he would. His estimates had held. His coordination had functioned under strain. The gamble Eisenhower had authorized had paid off precisely as planned. This changed the command dynamic. Eisenhower had always managed Patton carefully, balancing brilliance against risk. Now, the calculation shifted. The Bastogne relief demonstrated not impulsiveness but control. It showed that Patton's aggression could be harnessed without chaos, that his confidence rested on preparation, not instinct alone. German commanders recognized the shift as well. Reports from their side described growing concern about Allied flexibility. The expected paralysis had not materialized. Instead, they faced a coordinated counterattack that threatened encirclement. The Ardennes offensive had reached its high-water mark. From this point forward, Allied operations would tighten, not loosen. Patton's Third Army would continue to press north and east, forcing German units to divert strength and abandon objectives. For Eisenhower, Bastogne marked the moment when trust ceased to be provisional. It became operational. He did not celebrate Patton publicly. He did not indulge theatrics. He did something far more significant. He relied on him again. And that reliance would shape the final months of the war. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge. It changed its direction. German forces continued to fight through late December and into January, but the initiative was gone. The roads radiating from Bastogne, once intended as arteries for German armor, now served Allied counteroffensives. What had been a spearhead became a liability. Units committed deep into the Ardennes found themselves exposed, short on fuel, and increasingly vulnerable to air attack. Patton's Third Army did not pause after the breakthrough. Reinforcements widened the corridor into Bastogne. Artillery positions were stabilized. Supply lines were secured. The town, battered and frozen, became a functional strongpoint once again. To the north, British and American forces under Field Marshal Montgomery prepared their own counterstrokes. The Allied response was no longer reactive. It was deliberate. German losses mounted steadily. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel-littered forest roads. Infantry units, once confident, now faced constant pressure from multiple directions. Attempts to renew the offensive faltered under Allied air superiority as weather conditions improved. For Eisenhower, the crisis phase had passed. The immediate danger of a strategic breakthrough was over. The question now was exploitation. Patton's performance at Bastogne provided a clear answer. His army had demonstrated flexibility, endurance, and coordination under the most demanding conditions. The movement north had not crippled his forces. It had sharpened them. This altered Allied planning. Patton was no longer simply an aggressive option. He was a reliable instrument for complex operations. Subsequent orders reflected this shift. Third Army would play a central role in reducing the Bulge and then driving east toward the Rhine. The trust established at Bastogne was not abstract. It was embedded in tasking, authority, and expectation. As January wore on, German resistance continued to erode. The Ardennes gamble had failed. The cost in men, equipment, and irreplaceable reserves was devastating. But the full significance of Bastogne extended beyond immediate battlefield results. It reshaped command relationships at the highest level. With Bastogne secured and the German offensive stalled, Eisenhower's perspective on command shifted in subtle but profound ways. Patton had always been aggressive, often unpredictable, and occasionally politically inconvenient. Yet the events of December 1944 demonstrated a rare alignment between boldness and reliability. Eisenhower began to issue directives with greater confidence in Patton's judgment. The Third Army was entrusted with increasingly complex operations, clearing the northern Ardennes, stabilizing the Meuse line, and preparing for rapid penetration into the German heartland. Planning no longer involved second-guessing the commander. It relied on his execution. For Patton, the relief of Bastogne reinforced a personal philosophy that had guided him for years. Speed and surprise were the ultimate force multipliers, but only when underpinned by meticulous planning and logistical support. The pivot north had been audacious, yet every movement had been mapped, every supply line considered, every subordinate briefed. It was a disciplined gamble. The impact was immediate and measurable. Subsequent advances into Germany were faster, more coordinated, and less costly than previous operations. Patton's forces captured key bridges intact, secured supply routes, and forced German units into chaotic retreats. Each success reinforced Eisenhower's operational trust, transforming respect into reliance. Yet trust was not blind. Eisenhower continued oversight, ensuring Third Army movements complemented broader Allied strategy. Patton's accomplishments at Bastogne created a dynamic in which risk could be leveraged, but always within the framework of strategic coherence. The psychological effect extended to other Allied commanders. Seeing a major offensive executed under such severe conditions, and with results predicted in advance, bolstered confidence in American planning and adaptability. Soldiers on the front lines, from infantry to artillery crews, understood that coordination and leadership could directly influence survival. Bastogne had become both a tactical and symbolic turning point. By early 1945, Patton's reputation as a commander who could deliver under pressure was cemented. For Eisenhower, the events of December 1944 validated a critical lesson in leadership. Trust must be earned, tested, and observed, but once established, it becomes a force multiplier on the battlefield. Strategic decisions could now incorporate Patton's audacity without fear of unpredictable outcomes, shaping the final phases of the European campaign. The lessons of Bastogne, discipline under fire, coordination across complex axes, and the melding of audacity with reliability, would influence every Allied advance toward Germany's borders. Trust, born in crisis, became operational reality. Bastogne was more than a battle. It was a test of endurance, of command, and of human resolve. In the freezing Ardennes winter, surrounded by an enemy counting on their collapse, the soldiers held. But the broader story was not only about survival, it was about trust forged in the crucible of crisis. Eisenhower's reliance on Patton was never casual. It was earned through preparation, precision, and execution under extreme pressure. The pivot north was audacious, yes, but it was controlled, calculated, and decisive. Leadership in this moment revealed itself as a combination of vision and dependability, audacity tempered by discipline. For the men on the ground, trust translated into hope. Every march, every supply drop, every coordinated attack reinforced the belief that relief could, and would, arrive. Bastogne became a proving ground not only for armies, but for the principles that define effective command. History remembers Patton as bold, sometimes brash, often theatrical. History remembers Eisenhower as measured, strategic, cautious. But Bastogne reveals a subtler truth, that leadership and trust are inseparable in moments that decide the fate of nations. One cannot exist without the other. In the quiet aftermath, as snow melted and armies pressed forward into Germany, the significance endured. Trust, once tested and validated, becomes invisible infrastructure for action. It allows commanders to act decisively, subordinates to follow without hesitation, and entire operations to succeed against odds that seemed insurmountable. The Ardennes winter of 1944 stands as a testament. Courage matters, but trust, earned, tested, and confirmed, is what shapes the course of history. Eisenhower trusted Patton because Patton proved that audacity, when disciplined and coordinated, could deliver results. And in that trust, the Allies found one of the keys to victory in Europe.